as Calvin mentioned, I'm originally from Sturgeon County, so I travel up here quite a bit in the summertime. It's been 10 years of travel, so it's almost, what, 1 million kilometers, almost 1 million miles. So in those travels, I've seen lots. But yeah, so Calvin asked me to talk a little bit about managing grassy weeds in our annual cropping system, kind of the lead up to when you guys are establishing grass seed crops. So why is managing our grassy weeds important before establishing any seed crops? I mean, I think we know that they're very competitive. They compete really well with our grass forage stand seed crops. So they reduce the stand establishment, which has consequences for many years down the way in terms of yield production, but also in our established stands in terms of degrading the quality of those crops. So why are grass weeds in grass seed crops so difficult to control? So first and foremost, they all belong to the same family. And with that comes very limited herbicide options. And so we can think about just in our annual crops how it's difficult to kill volunteer barley in wheat. So a lot of the herbicides are all very similar across multiple grass species. Grasses are very competitive, whether they're a weed or a crop. And so weeds have managed to have some good adaptations, which I'll get into, that help them outcompete a lot of the crops that we do grow. Seed contamination, there's a lot of really tiny seeds that get into things, carry across crops, and so they find their ways to be introduced very easily into new environments. The persistent seed bank. So there's a saying in gardening that the 1 year's seeding, or weeding, the seeding of weed seeds leads you to 7 years of weeding. It takes a long time to get a handle on the introduction of weeds. And when you have bad weather conditions and spray misses and things, it just contributes and compounds those problems. The lack of effective cultural controls in our own seed crops. You think that we're growing a seed crop, it's the same crop. So there's not a lot of diversity for 3 years. So it allows for a lot of these grassy weeds to adapt really well into those environments. And then, of course, herbicide resistance. So what are the problem grass weeds that I'm going to talk about today? I'm going to focus a little in on wild oats, partly because it's top 3. It's always something that continuously as an agronomist, always dealing with, and it's not going away, and it's getting more complicated. Annual bluegrass and barnyard grass species are 2 that made the 2023 weed survey that Brianne had talked about for the first time. And that's a bit of a kind of an alarming, I guess, as an agronomist to go, okay, why are they showing up now? I'll talk again a little bit about foxtail barley and then touch a bit on downy brome, Japanese brome. I don't deal a lot with it because it's more of a southern, but I think it's one of those that's also important just to get to know. So, kind of the saying, it's important to know thy enemy. It's important to understand a little bit about the weed biology in order to figure out best ways to manage. So wild oats, obviously it's an annual grass weed, barely taller than many of the crops that we grow, and we see it lovely panicles above the canopy. So a bit about the seed production. Typical plants can produce anywhere from 20 to 150 seeds per plant. And of course, that's going to be dependent on kind of crop densities and the environment it's in. We're fairly familiar with those dark seeds, with those little basal scars, or we call sucker mouths on the long awns, so that when they come in contact with moisture, they can dig themselves nicely into the soil and provide a kind of the perfect germination environment. So the good and the bad, I guess, maybe a little bit about wild oats is that anywhere from 30 to 70% of those seeds can shatter prior to the harvest of crops like wheat. And that could be good in the sense that they're not contaminating our samples, but it's also problematic for some of the technology like the weed destructor, which is supposed to be collecting the seeds in the harvest sample, so it's not as effective. So one of the issues with wild oats and why we have challenges managing it is because of the moderately persistent seed bank. So typically 4 to 5 years is the age of the seeds can last. We know that there's at least 1% of those populations that can last longer. I had the luxury of studying wild oats in my master's thesis, so I've looked and counted lots of seeds and looked at stuff, and the good news is that most of those seeds lose viability in the first 2 years. And that's great because we can exploit that kind of characteristic of the wild oat seed bank. So most of the seeds typically start germinating around 5 degrees and start flushing throughout the growing season. Unfortunately, we can still see wild oats flushing well into the late part of June after we've done a lot of our herbicide applications. Again, part of the reason why this weed tends to show up every year. The germination and emergence typically occur within those 1 to 2 inches, so the top 5 centimeters of the seed bed, and then we see kind of reductions in that emergence the deeper we go down. So as soon as we get down to kind of 6 inches, we get less and less. But it's not, there's been a few cases where emergence has been seen up to depths of 7 to 8 inches. So that's quite a deep profile. So Brianne talked a lot about herbicide resistance. So we do have resistance to the groups 1, 2, 14, and 15. But if we look globally across the world, we've got group 3 and group 9, so glyphosate resistant. And I think it's important to kind of know what lies ahead for us in terms of our own practices. So, in Alberta, 69% of our wild oat populations are herbicide resistant, and I mean, as an agronomist, we make the assumption that most of the wild oat populations have some level of resistance in it. I think the worrisome part is the cross resistance to multiple groups. When we have groups 1s, 2s, 15s, and even products like group 14s that don't even have activity on wild oats, we have cross resistance to. Barnyard grass. This has probably become one of my biggest nemesis. So there are 2 species that occur as weeds across Western Canada. There's an introduced Eurasian species, which I think most of us associate with barnyard grass. It's the Echinocloa cruscali, but there's a native species also, the muricata. They're both annual species. For identification, they're one of those kind of fun grasses that we go, there's no ligules, oracles, easy to identify based on those. But they're a very competitive grass species because of this spreading growth habit. They have fibrous roots, they're an annual, but in that spreading growth habit, those nodes, when they come in contact, can actually root from there. So it kind of helps with that competition. They kind of have a purplish hue to them, and they have that very compact panicle with a bit of a purple tinge. So why is barnyard grass even, some of you might have seen some of it in your gardens, why do we care about this? It's the ability for this grass to produce a copious amount of seed. So, there's been reports up to 1 million seeds, and that's a lot of seeds for a grass weed. Typically, we associate that with maybe like pigweeds and some of our other broadleaves. But typically, the cruscali can produce anywhere from 7,000 to 71,000 seeds, and the native species is very similar, 13,000 to 37,000. So quite a robust amount of seed. The ability to distinguish them requires you to have really good eyesight or a magnification to separate them out. Send them to a lab if in doubt. I have had to send samples to the Saskatchewan Crop Protection Lab just to do a diagnostic on some of these. Because you basically are looking at the lemma of the seed on the seed coat to see if there's hairs or not, and it can be very difficult. Distribution is pretty much throughout Alberta. We see it on roadsides, stream beds, cultivated fields. And around Sturgeon County, my kind of home base, I've just seen this weed explode. It is everywhere you go. They're small seeds. They're very inconspicuous in many ways. If I go back to this back picture here. So in the fields of wheat where you see the rows, in between the rows are these little tiny grass seedlings that are just poking up. They're so inconspicuous. And the problem is that's what our target is at the herbicide application timing. So They stick to equipment, and since 2020, we've seen a massive spread because we had lots of moisture, and they stuck to a lot of harvest equipment, and now they're pretty much at the introduction to every field. You see it, and they're just slowly starting to spread. I've started to see it in the Peace Country, so you're not isolated from it. We know that there are some resistant groups to the introduced species of barnyard grass. I have sent away tests to look at the native species. Nothing was group 2 resistant. It's just a prolific seed grower. Globally, barnyard grass is very important because it's a weed that we see in a lot of rice fields. So hence why globally there's a lot of resistance to it. But it's an awareness because there is glyphosate resistance. There's resistance to some of the group 4s like quinaclorac that are active on these weeds, and unfortunately there is a potential to develop resistance in those areas. Annual bluegrass. So annual, but can be a short-lived perennial in our lawns and pastures. Kind of very compact and tufted. And as Calvin mentioned, we're starting to see this one show up. And I have a few fields. It is also one of those inconspicuous weeds that we kind of go, maybe don't notice too much of until there's a widespread patch of it. Again, can kind of grow prostrate as well, which allows that kind of good competition. But can be confused with other grass species. And that comes down to, again, is it Kentucky bluegrass? Is it Canada bluegrass? What is it? And so it's very important to take the time to identify some of these grass weeds. Maybe not as prolific seed producer as maybe a barnyard grass, but there's still thousands of seeds that can be produced per mature plant. And they germinate fairly easily, but again, some of these can persist in the seed bank. There's been one study that said about 24% of that seed bank can persist for 6 years. So hence why we need planning, because it's going to take multiple years to manage some of these weeds that maybe we're not as familiar with. So best adapted to moist, fertile soils, pHs of 5.5 to 6.5. Peace region looks pretty good for it. But what I think is interesting is it has a fairly high tolerance to kind of poorly aerated and compacted soils. So areas where Calvin showed his picture, corners of the field where maybe there's more traffic. So I think that would be great if it was just those small, poor areas, but those are also the areas where we have poor crop competition. So there's been some herbicide resistance in Canada to group 2s, but because this is a fairly predominant weed globally in turf, multiple different groups. And you'll notice glufosinate, glyphosate are on that list. Touch a little bit on downy brome, more of a southern Alberta weed, but very competitive. So it can be an annual, winter annual, or biennial, but typically is a winter annual. Very fibrous root system, lots of soft, dense hairs along the leaf blades and sheath. Typically at kind of maturity, you'll have that purplish red kind of coloration to it. But has those nice kind of drooping purplish panicles. Flowering typically occurs between May and July, depending if it's an annual or winter annual. So earlier flowering if it's a winter annual, but if it's an annual species, it may have that flowering window a little later. So seed production typically is dependent on the density. So lower density of plants generally typical results in higher seed production. So we can get 400 seeds per plant in more low dense type of environments. But there's been some reports, that with a really heavy stand, you can get, 70 million seeds per acre. So I'm not sure who counted all those or how they came across some of that, but to put that in perspective, our wheat seeding rates are about 2 million seeds per acre. So that's a lot of seed. Okay. Good news is I guess they rarely persist for more than 2 to 3 years, or typically less than 5 years. Problem is that they do really well in dry, saline conditions, and generally are a good indicator where we've got, poor conditions in our range. So maybe there's been, native vegetation that's been disturbed, and allow this weed to kind of creep in. It's been found all across Canada already, except for in Newfoundland. And globally, there's been a few more cases of resistance. Alberta's got the first case of glyphosate resistance in southern Alberta. But yeah, there are group 1s and 2s. And the kind of, I guess, comparative relative that's equally as bad is this Japanese brome. Again, more found in southern parts of the province, but tends to like moisture a little bit more than downy brome. So very similar in its growth habitat. Difference, the ability to distinguish between them is very difficult unless you look at the ligule, but the later stages when it's actually in reproduction, it's more of a pale tan color. So similarly to downy brome, lots of seed production. These two can coexist together. And this also is kind of problematic in terms of maybe resistant populations that do exist. So typically, if we had glyphosate resistance in our downy brome and group 2 resistance in our Japanese brome, that provides some issues in terms of how we manage. Okay, I think this is my last one. So foxtail barley is simple perennial. We're pretty familiar, I think, with this, those grayish green leaves, long noting spikes that nothing wants to touch or eat. But it has those very fibrous roots that grow in clumps. And the seed production for foxtail barley is actually fairly, I think, robust and I think deceiving. So we can get a range anywhere from 10 to 300 seeds per plant, but on average 100 seeds. Where foxtail barley has an advantage over maybe some of the other weeds is that we've got 2 periods of germination. We've got a period in the fall time after those seeds are ripe and they are blowing across the field. There's a period for them to establish. But then there's also another time in the springtime that they can also establish. And so that's why I think a lot of the years we go, well, I only had a few plants, and then the next year we have a full-blown infestation sometimes. And so it's being aware of that. And those seeds can remain viable for up to 7 years as well. So, persistent. They also establish very well in a lot of areas that aren't very competitive for crop growth. And so that too provides a bit of a dilemma in terms of finding ways to compete with this. So how do we manage them? So that's my job as an agronomist. That's what my clients pay me to do, is to figure out ways to manage many of these weeds. I've had the, luxury of working on projects where we've looked at different multiple strategies to manage herbicide-resistant weeds, or just weeds in general. And, Brianne's message with Neil Harker's project really is the more types of integrated weed management practices we can put together, the better it's going to be for the outcome. So the weeds are kind of the enemy. It's more like, how do I find a perfect strategy that's going to outsmart them? And that's kind of the every year approach to them. So, reducing the stability in them makes it harder for those weeds to establish. So there are many components of integrated weed management, and I'm going to give a few examples on a couple of them. So there are many growers that are utilizing direct seeding, and this is great because if you think about where all the weed seeds are, they're in the top 5 centimeters of that soil kind of thatch layer. And that's great when we're, it's exposing a lot of those weeds to environmental extremes. So a year like 2020 where we had lots of moisture, there was a lot of weed seeds that died because things just rotted. And so, those environmental conditions do, provide some, benefit maybe. But, there are biological things happening too that can work to our advantage. But they also provide a good basis for when we're doing some of our soil residual herbicides. So I'd like to kind of think of it as, this is kind of the first layer when we're applying a product to kind of look at later emerging things or weeds that are going to emerge outside of the window that I'm trying to manage. So products like Avidex, for example, on wild oats give us a bit of a broad spectrum window to manage. And if the weather conditions are too hot, too cold, too wet, there is another layer of protection kind of at the basis of that where we can kind of work within. And we're also adding other herbicide groups. But there's lots of things to consider when dealing with soil residual herbicides and kind of what's going to work best. So small seeded weeds versus large seeded weeds. So barnyard grass or really tiny seeds, and that can affect, that actually helps with some of the residuals because it doesn't take much herbicide to actually come in contact with those little tiny seeds to have good efficacy. A little more difficult with wild oats where we've got big seeds. Can also say maybe even the distribution, right? If we've got wild oat seeds that are coming from the depths of 4 to 6 inches, they're going to not be in those layers where we're getting activity on them, where a lot of sometimes the smaller seeds kind of stay within the top layers. Granular versus liquid applications, and I think this kind of stems to sometimes we use tillage to incorporate those granular products, which then stimulates the weed seed bank as well. And sometimes that can be good because then we get a bigger flush of weeds that come out. But the key is not to be burying those seeds too deep either so that we kind of prolong some of the problems. So there are a multitude of different soil residual products on the market, and it's, I think, difficult sometimes to navigate which ones to be using, but sometimes we have multiple of weeds. In some cases I have wild oat that's resistant to group 1 and group 2 and maybe a trilate, and I also have barnyard grass. So I think these are some of the challenges we deal with in those systems and why we can't just rely solely either on herbicides. So some say tillage is a dirty word. I think it can be still a tool. Obviously we use it to incorporate granular herbicides, but it can be used for residue management as well so that we're establishing the best seed crop for the next year, which is part of it, is part of putting together an integrated plan so that we have the best establishment for those seedlings for the next year. But can also spread things. So if we've got quackgrass and we've got Canada thistle, is tillage the best tool to be implementing in those areas as well? So we need to account for other weed species in there because that may actually cause them to, explode and when we have bigger problems. A little bit about seed burial, and some of the research with downy brome or Japanese brome talk about a bit of burying them because they're tinier seeds and getting them down. Some of these weeds are in very sensitive areas too, where maybe tillage is not going to be the best tool. So that's also kind of weighing out some of the risks. But tillage for foxtail barley, sometimes it can be an effective area to do patch management and take out a very established population. But we have to remember that that's the only thing that we need to do. We have to follow up with all the seedlings that are going to germinate that fall or the next spring and kind of keep on top of it. Mowing, and kind of in the same bracket, I'd say silage, are great ways to reduce seed production. You see things like the barnyard grass where we're, got millions of seed potentially, in an area. We don't want that seed going back in. And so, I have customers who silage some of their areas where they have wild oats because that's the most effective tool to bring down the seed bank. So crop rotation, I'll touch base maybe on just a few things. So, changing the life cycles. So for, where we have wild oats, sometimes it's nice to introduce the fall rise, the winter wheats, in order to look at different kind of timings. But it's not maybe great to have those where we have lots of winter annuals, okay, in terms of our grass weeds. The cultivars, I'm really interested to see what Brianne comes with her study, because we know there are certain, short-statured wheat varieties, and they're great. They reduce the amount of straw that goes back in, but they're really poor competitors for wild oats. And so choosing the right fields for the varieties that you're growing is equally important, because if you're planning on growing a forage grass down the road, you may have just increased the problem rather than trying to reduce your problem. The change of seeding dates and harvest dates, rotating annual crops, broadleaf crops. I think some of these are basic, but I think sometimes we forget some of these basic fundamental principles. rotating competitive and non-competitive crops. I think, the use of our Roundup Ready 2 gene, so here at Roundup Ready 2, where we can spray 0.67 liters of glyphosate. In some cases, this has been a great cleanup tool because now I have a strategy where I can go in multiple times on a field that has group 1, group 2 resistant wild oat and just bring those populations down. So I think there's opportunities to kind of utilize small tools like that to our advantage and change up maybe the application. So I have a lot of growers that love an early seeding date, and this has been, has traditionally worked out really well, but it has its challenges when you have herbicide resistant populations. And part of that is just the timing. So there's lots of benefits to early seeding, spring moisture, the heat stress during flowering, we can avoid some of those windows. We typically can outcompete a lot of weeds earlier on when we've got a good crop established, but a lot of it's just helped with enhancing our yields. The other piece would be seeding rates, and you don't have to do a plan across an entire field. There are many times where we can go, I will bump my wheat seeding rate or my barley seeding rate up on a portion of the field where I know my wild oats is heavier, or I've got heavier barnyard grass. Those are pieces to, I think, utilize, and maybe we don't, we kind of forget, or we think it's an all or none type of application. And one that gets maybe overlooked, fertilizer placement. The application timing and placement are just as important than anything. And I mean, fertility obviously is the foundation for most of what we do, but I have guys that broadcast ammonium sulfate in the fall time, okay? I have to make sure that those are on fields that are clean, that they're not weedy, because what am I doing? Otherwise, I'm going to be fertilizing those weeds for next year. So it's pointless, it's utilizing. So I think, we have to do a good job on the weed management to take advantage of all the other kind of agronomic practices that we want to implement as well. And a few kind of herbicide considerations. So kind of putting it all together. So I have fields that have, let's say wild oat resistance. I'm increasing my seeding rates. I'm growing the most competitive varieties. I'm trying to get in there early. I'm going to utilize what I know to exploit the seed bank. Some herbicide considerations. Okay. I kind of look at myself as a bit of a logistics coordinator sometimes because plans change. Last year it was too cold, it was too windy, all these environmental conditions. Well, you have to pivot sometimes. And so, there are times where our pre-seed we miss. It's nothing growing, I'll do it as a post-seed. Okay, well that might work for a few fields, but where you have heavy wild oats, where you have foxtail barley, you have to be committed a bit to what the plan's going to be. Or know that your window is very tiny in order to get the job done. Okay. Brianne talked a bit about the changing of like small weeds and large weeds and what the difference is. I was kind of chuckling because as an agronomist, we'll go out there and then we go, the sprayer's going to get there in like 5 days. Okay, well now what size is that weed? Things are changing, and so we have to change herbicide rates. That might be increasing our glyphosate rate in the spring with our tank mix. Maybe our tank mix partner, it's a 40-acre jug. Well, guess what? Maybe that has to go up to the 30-acre jug because we've got heavier populations. So I think we have to look at, the flexibility in our products. A lot of products do have some low rates, high rates, but I think sometimes we forget to look at that. The inclusion of those soil-applied herbicides, I don't see as much of it up in the Peace Country as, say, more in the south. Part of that is driven by kochia, but I think it's something we're going to see a bit more up this way. Water volumes, increasing the water volumes. And still the simplest thing to get coverage. If it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too windy, add more water. It's a very simple strategy to get you through a lot of things and to improve your results. Post-emergence, just a few things, tank mixes and compatibility. Everybody's trying to throw more things in the tank to get that one pass done. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes we have to do split applications in order to improve efficacy. There are a number of agronomists throughout central Alberta now that do not tank mix a group 1 and any group 4s together. It's a group 1, has a separate app, and a group 4 because of the risk of antagonism. They want to get the most efficacy out of their group 1s. And the challenge is the mixture of weed populations that we're dealing with. I think it's getting more complex where we have, in the south, we may have downy brome and Japanese brome and foxtail barley and wild oat all in the same field. So I have fields that have group 1, group 2, resistance to triolate, so group 15. They have Aphanomyces, they have clubroot. So those are the complexities that I think we work with and why we can't just rely on one sole practice. And the last two kind of comments, pre-harvest. So if we're not doing our pre-harvest or we're desiccating and we want to follow up, the post-harvest window is a very good time. It's where a lot of planning actually happens, is kind of in that pre-harvest to post-harvest. What are we growing for the next year? What kind of residual herbicides do we need to put down? Should we be fertilizing this in the fall time? So making some of those decisions. And there are some weeds like Japanese and downy brome where that is the window to get the best advantage in terms of the herbicide down, setting your crop populations for the next year, and then deciding what your post kind of applications are going to look like. Okay. So I guess in summary, it's an evolving program. There are, I think continual grassy weed species that are going to come into our kind of, our cropping fields and, are going to put some more challenges on how we manage them in the forages. But those are the 4-year, 5-year plans because it's really hard to get a good handle on some of these weeds just in 1 year. So I think with that, I'll switch over.